I love singing. It's just a whole lot better when somebody can sing who's good. And that just helps us all out. And we've got a great worship team, great church. And we're going to have a great morning this morning. Yeah, you can put your hands together. We can get like rowdy. I mean, who said church had to be boring, you know? And so I'm excited to be with you this morning. My name's Dylan. My wife and I, Kirsty's at the downtown campus right now, tearing it up. And you guys, unfortunately, are stuck with me. The lesser half in this relationship, I understand that. But Kirsty and I, we oversee the youth and young adults here at Manor House, and grateful to serve such a great community. And before we jump into the message today, I want to actually ask you to do something. April's a kind of a big month in church circles because we get to celebrate this thing called Easter. And Easter is we not just recognize the death of Jesus, but we celebrate his resurrection and his life. Because Jesus is alive, we have faith that we are going to continually live in him, that this life isn't the end, but that there's hope and a future, that death is not the end, death is just the next chapter. And so we get to celebrate Jesus at a time called Easter, and oftentimes people are open to God around the time of Easter. And we actually have this notion that God wants Manor House to impact the city of Portland and Vancouver, that there's people in our world, in our circles, that might not realize it, but they need saving, and that how will they be saved if nobody tells them the good news? And that's our responsibility, not the preacher's responsibility, but a Christian's responsibility. And how do I reach the people that are around me? So in front of you, we just wanted to take a first step at how we do this. And there's a card. It's just simply a prayer card. And this isn't for you to turn in, but this is just a card. If you just reach in front of you, and all we're saying is like, who are some people that are in your world that you want to just start praying for? God, would you just open their hearts? Would you just soften them to you, God? They desperately need you. We know, we can see how you could intervene, but God, I pray that they would open their hearts to how you could intervene. And so if you would just take that card, and as a church, could we just be committed to praying for those that are around us? And so put that in your Bible, or maybe you don't see your Bible every day. That's okay. We don't judge here at this Church for the Journey. Maybe you see your mirror every day. Put it on the mirror and just be reminded, to be committed to praying for those, because we recognize that it's ultimately God who transforms and changes hearts. And so it'd be just cool to have thousands of people praying for the city of Portland, Vancouver, in the month of April. And so with that, we're going to jump into the series and continue the series today, Culture Matters. Has anybody else been enjoying this series? I've been like thoroughly enjoying that. You know, that underwhelming response isn't even shaking my confidence one bit. I'm thoroughly enjoying this series, Culture Matters. And the purpose of this series is to simply for us to recognize that God's placed you and I in society not to simply be this exclusive club, but he's placed us in society to transform and change it. And oftentimes I think that we can, in a Western Americanized society, we can think through the last 10, 15, 20 years, and we can decry, man, how bad society is and how it's falling apart. Yet when you read the Bible, you realize that there's nothing new under the sun, that humanity from the very beginning since the fall has desperately needed Jesus, and it's the church's responsibility to be salt and light in the world. I love the analogy of salt, that you put salt on something to preserve it. And the reason why Jesus said for you and I to be salt is, as the church, as Christians, we are what preserves society. We are what shows them the right way to live, that we are the light, that Jesus in us is the light of the world, that we show society the right way to live. And even though society might be falling apart, how many of you know God is not surprised? God is not like, oh my goodness, America, this is crazy. I did not see this coming, you know? That's not God's perspective. He's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe who is or who isn't president. This just caught me by surprise, you know? Nothing surprises God. And so the security of being a Christian is recognizing God's ultimately in control, but we recognize that we have a responsibility. And so this whole series is how do we walk out our faith when culture comes in contradiction to it? And for the longest time, I think we've had the benefit of living a society that has been based and is still based on Christian values, but we find that it's postmodern in the sense that it's moving away from a Christianity value system and moving towards more of a humanistic value system, which now we begin to see why that comes in conflict with our belief system. It doesn't mean that there's no Christians anymore. It just means that most people in our society don't think or have the same value system that you would if you're coming from that Judeo Christian ethic. And so this whole series is how do we live and not just survive, but how do we thrive in a society like that? And so we've been looking at the book of Daniel, and just to recap, Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were born into Judah, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, comes in because Judah turned their backs on God. Nebuchadnezzar comes in and takes them into captivity and brings them into the land of Babylon. They were raised in Jewish culture. They would have read the scriptures. And so now they find themselves immersed in a culture that was not conducive to their belief system. And I'm going to throw this out there. Ken said this isn't fact, but it's something that we could at least think about, that Daniel and his friends were placed in Babylonian culture, that they became the head of like the astrologers and the astronomers, they became in charge, the principal of the school of like witchcraft and wizardry. There's no way around it, they became the principals of Hogwarts, if you want to think about it like that. Like as Christians, they oversaw that whole element of society. They, because of their character, because of their obedience to God, they were put in charge. And we see that they didn't just survive in that culture, but they thrived. That God's intention, and it was God's intention for them to be there, that God wasn't caught off guard by Nebuchadnezzar, that God's intention was for them to be in that society. God's intention was for them not just to get by, to just not make it, to not just find a tight little community and us three and no more, but his intention was that they would affect society for his goodness. That's something to think about, and we don't know if this is true or not, but some people have proposed the wise men that encountered Jesus, the wise men from Chaldea, it could have been influenced hundreds of years because of what Daniel and his friends did in that society. We don't know if it's true or not, but we recognize that God uses his people to influence the culture that we're in. And so today, as we continue this topic, I want to talk to you on the topic of how do we exercise our faith in this type of culture? How do we stand for the things that are right while recognizing that it's our responsibility to win those around us? Because there's a right way to stand and there's a wrong way to stand. In fact, the topic, I guess, is how do we exercise our faith in the culture that we live in that might not be conducive to our belief system. And if you're new to church, my prayer is that you would hear a message about how good God is, and that when you give your life, when we give our life to Jesus, that he has the best possible plan on how a human is able to flourish. And so if you have your Bibles, we're going to pick it up in Daniel chapter 3, and let me just kind of recap or give some background on Daniel chapter 3 as we've been going through this series. It's been about 18 years or so since Daniel's interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And so Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been serving in the king's courts. They've been serving culture. They've got a government job. They've been faithful in the little things. And 18 years go by, and Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon is now a world empire. Nebuchadnezzar is one of the few people in the history of planet Earth to hold the title, not just commander-in-chief, but master of the universe. That the known world, as it was known in that day, he was the supreme exalted ruler. That Babylon was an empire that encompassed the known world, that it was large and it was in charge. And so because it was large and in charge, and Nebuchadnezzar the king was at the top of the food chain, that he had ultimate authority on earth. Remember, all authority is given by God, but he had all authority. And so it was his decisions on whether who lived or died. It was his decisions on what was right or wrong. He was the one directed like what culture was and what culture wasn't. It was he had the ability to say, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. If you're going to live in Babylon, you have to live according to my statutes. You have to live according to how I want you to live. That he was the one that was in charge. And I think there's at least the lesson that we can take from that. It's really easy when we experience success or authority to attribute that to ourselves. It's really easy to think that we get into a position of success or authority. It's really easy to think that we had something to do with it. But even Nebuchadnezzar, as you read down the chapters, that God had ultimate authority, and God actually removed Nebuchadnezzar from that position for a season of his life, because man is not in control, God is. God is in control. And so, but because of Nebuchadnezzar and his position, you can kind of let things get to your head. And so he builds a 90-foot statue, an idol of himself, and he makes this edict, and he says, we're going to have everybody in this empire bow down to this statue. And what is he saying? Basically, that Babylon and everything that it encompasses, and Babylon and everything that it epitomizes, and this culture that I have life and death. I snap my fingers, you live or you die. Like I determine what's right or wrong. I'm the supreme leader, I'm king, and I'm going to build a statue, and I'm going to ask everybody to bow down and submit to this. That it's not just like a, hey, let's worship an idol. It's saying that this represents the way that everybody is supposed to live. And as we read this story, we realize that that now has become in direct conflict with a couple of guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's belief system. And we're going to look at how they exercise their faith in this type of situation. So if you have your Bibles, Daniel chapter 3, verse 3 is where we'll pick up the story. And this is what it says. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, man, all the bigwigs, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Next slide. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn," they had a full-on worship service. Here we go. The pipe, the lyre, the trigon, I think, the harp, the bagpipe, some Scottish influence, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace. And so this is the context in which we recognize that these young men are engaged in, that they're facing now a situation where their belief system, or let me say it like this, their Christianity is now in conflict with the culture that they live in. And how they exercise their faith, I think, is not just an example, but it's almost God saying, this is how you can live in that kind of culture and still not just survive, but thrive. That how do you live in a culture, how do we live in a culture that elevates culture to the level of divine? How do we, if you're a Christian, how do you live in a society that says these are the cultural norms that now dictate life, that dictate right and wrong, that dictate the way your life is supposed to be lived? This passage answers this question for you and I. And I think we could all draw from parallels of the society today that I don't know, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to recognize that there's certain ideals and there's certain things that culture tells you and I that you are supposed to live to these standards, you're supposed to live to these ethics, because why? If you do these things, you'll experience life. And how do we do that when it becomes or is in contradiction to our belief system? And so basically an overview of what we're going to look at today is how do you exercise your faith in that type of society, is we watch by watching what we worship, that we exercise our faith by being powerful in our innocence. We exercise our faith by being known by our relationship to Jesus. And so if you're taking down notes, just simply write down this title, Exercising My Faith, putting my faith into practice. And when we look at society and we see how dark it is, I think God sees this as simply an opportunity that when it comes into contradiction, it causes us to stand out, which ultimately allows God to be seen. Would you bow your heads, close your eyes, and let's pray. Father, I thank you for your word. Jesus, I thank you that it's living and that it's active. God, I pray if there's anybody here today that's distant from you, God, I think sometimes society so often tries to tell us a way to live that offers satisfaction, but it doesn't deliver. God, I pray if there's anybody here disillusioned with society, disillusioned with what society has to offer, Jesus, I pray that they would encounter you and they would encounter living water. They would encounter something that satisfies, that they encounter you that satisfies our soul. God, I pray if there's anybody here that's experiencing pressure, God, it almost feels like they're going into their own furnace. God, I pray that today they would see the purpose behind it. I pray that they would recognize that maybe this isn't a setback, but maybe this is a setup for you to be honored and for you to be glorified. Jesus, today, front to the back, left to right, whether we know you, whether we're distant from you, God, whether we've been walking with you our entire life, I pray that today you would speak to me. Jesus, speak to me. God, remind me of how good you are. Remind me of your goodness in our life. Jesus, anybody here that doesn't know you, God, I pray that it be your kindness that leads them to you. God, we ask these things in your mighty name. And everybody said, amen. When we read this story, we read this story about Nebuchadnezzar who sets up an image, an idol that looks like him. And as I said before, that this image basically is a description. It's a representation of everything that Babylon represented, the culture, the rulership of Nebuchadnezzar. And that Nebuchadnezzar, he told everybody in the kingdom that you're supposed to bow down to this. And that word bow down means to be submitted to. When you bow down to something, you give whatever you bow down to the authority, the right over your life. That's what it means to bow down. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, coming from Jewish background would have read Jewish scriptures, which you recognize is in direct contradiction to what God says, that when it comes to bowing down, that you don't just bow down to an image. In fact, Exodus chapter 20, most of us would recognize kind of the 10 commandments. This would be what would be on the forefront of their mind, that when you read Exodus chapter 20, we'll throw it up on the screen, this is what it says. God said to his people, he said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is heaven above or is in earth below. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. And so oftentimes when it comes to our 21st American belief system, we read a scripture like this and we think to ourselves, how old and archaic, how primitive, how primal, that somebody would actually think that a statue could actually give them life. You know, I'm so grateful that in this day and age, you know, like we don't actually believe that. You know, I mean, you know, you walk into a restaurant and maybe there's like a little Buddha with some things in front of him, but you know, like that's like the exception. Like nobody does this idol thing anymore. You know, like that idol thing, like that's like old school. Like we don't even do that anymore. Like, hey Dylan, great message. Thanks for talking to us about idols. Got it. Check. Moving on. But this is what Exodus says. You're not going to bow down to any image or anything in likeness. And when it comes to idolatry, the worship of idols, this is what idolatry simply means. It's valuing something more than we value God. Say that. Idolatry, when you bow down or you worship something, is simply valuing something more than we value God. It's looking to something as the ultimate satisfaction outside of God. I remember kind of my first experience with this as an 8-year-old. My parents, you know, were in the shops one day, and unfortunately my mom let me walk down the toy aisle, which if you are a parent with little kids, you just avoid that at all cost because it's just not going to be pretty, because all of a sudden as a child, you're going to see some things that you desperately want. And I remember walking down this toy aisle as an 8-year-old, and all of a sudden on the shelf, I recognized that there was like this box of Lego, which if you're an 8-year-old boy, that is the jam. You know, Lego is like, this is God's gift to humanity. And so I saw on this shelf, I saw this box of Lego. It was like, I remember exactly what it was. It was like this little truck with like a space rocket with the Lego figures, and I remember exactly, it was $29.99. That's how like vivid that image is birthed in my mind. And my mom was like, no, I'm not gonna buy that for you, but you can save your money. And so it was on, because everything that I need in this life is found in that box. If I could just have that Lego set, then I could die and go to heaven. God, you could take me. I will be satisfied because I will have everything for human flourishing if I could just simply achieve that, the box of Lego. Like, it will satisfy my soul like nothing else could. And so I remember I started saving birthday money and pocket money, and I realized about 4 weeks into it, as an 8-year-old, I was about $15 in, and I'm like, man, this is gonna take me a long time. So I convinced my brother. I'm gonna say, hey, brother, dear brother, you need this just as much as I will. It'll satisfy my soul. It'll satisfy your soul as well. And so let's go Harvey's, and he happened to have $15. It was a match made in heaven. And so I finally got him on board. We went to the shop. We bought the Lego set, and it was incredible. Took it home. My brother's like, hey, can I help? I'm like, get out of here. Put that thing together. It was incredible. And like a week later, it found itself with all the other Lego that I'd found. And the reason I think it's so vivid in my memory is because I remember thinking to myself, if I could just have that, let me use a modern vernacular, if I could just have that, I would be happy. Only to discover that what I thought would make me happy didn't truly satisfy me, and I was on to the next thing. Have you recognized that there's things in your life that you might not say this is a God, but this is what your thought process is? If I could just have that, then I would experience happiness. If I could just achieve that, or if I could have that, then I would be satisfied. Have you noticed that humanity, when it comes to gods and idols, have you noticed that we are God-making machines? Like, we are great at making gods out of literally everything. And when it comes to the society that we live in, society pumps us full of this notion, this ideology, that if you can simply achieve this, then you'll achieve satisfaction. That when it comes to the movies that we watch, this is what we are told, that if you just simply get the right relationship, like if you're single, man, you are a half person right now until you get married. Which, by the way, Christianity is one of the few belief systems that elevate singleness and marriage at the exact same level. Paul says if you're single, don't try and be married. If you're married, don't try and be single. This notion that relationship, the purpose of it is to extend God's kingdom. And so if you're single, there's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, God says this is an opportunity for you to be used by God more than ever. But society says you're not going to be happy until you have a relationship. And not just a relationship, you got to experience and cross some boundaries. You got to have sex, and that is the ultimate fulfillment. And we buy the lie. When it comes to society, we get pumped full of this idea that you have to have this thing called status, that if you can hustle enough so people know your name, then you're going to experience satisfaction. When people know who you are, you'll have no need for anything else. And so what do? We give ourselves over so much so. We've got to get the channel. We've got to get the likes and the popularity. We give ourselves thinking that the more affection that I can get from strangers, the more satisfied I will be from people that don't even know me. Here's one that I actually think is a big one in our society. We make a god out of education. In fact, let me say it like this. Like idol, like we can take good things and they become an idol because we take a good thing and we make it a God thing. And education is a good thing. We should have I have an education. Like education is valuable. Education is good. It has the ability to change your life. Education can't transform you though. It can't change you from the inside out. And education, as good as it is, what society needs is not just educated people, it needs transformed people. And we make a God out of education. We can say, man, that's all I need, because if I get educated, then I can get the right career. And if I can get the right career, which now becomes a God, and I devote my entire life to my career, I can get the husband, I can get the wife, I can get the 2-story house and the picket fence and the 2.2 kids. And if I can achieve that, then I will have everything I need to flourish. Are we at least evaluating our own life right now? Like, is there anything that if you were to be honest, you say, man, maybe I've taken something good and I've made that now a God? Money. It's a God in our society. If I have more money, then the more money I have is the direct result of how much satisfaction I can achieve. More money means more satisfaction, and as humanity from the very beginning, whether it's a golden statue or it's an ideology, we are God-making machines. And so let's ask the question, why does God tell us not to bow down and worship anything else? Like is God this like insecure God? He's like, oh my goodness, I hope they don't find something better than me. You know? Oh boy, I hope they don't discover this thing called relationship. Man, like, don't worship money. They might realize how good that is, and they might abandon me. Like, is that why God makes this commandment? Like, don't bow down and worship. Like, why does God tell us not to worship something else? I think the answer is found in the very beginning. That in the very beginning, when God created humanity, this is how God made mankind. In Genesis 1:27, I think it's on the screen. This is how God made mankind. It says this: so God created man. Here's our word: in His own image. In the image of God, He created a male and female. He created them, and God blessed them. And He said to them that when God created humanity, He said the best version of humanity is when humanity is in my image. The best version of a human, the best condition that you can find yourself in is when you find yourself in the image of God. When you look like God, that is when your condition for human flourishing experiences satisfaction. And there's a spiritual principle that most of us might not recognize, that what you worship, you actually become like. That what you emulate and what you look to satisfy actually has the ability, because you've submitted to it, you give it the right to have control and change your life. People come up to me all the time and they say, Dylan, I don't know if you know this, but your son Avery looks exactly like you. I'm like, shocking. Sorry, bud. You're stuck with these genes. The worst, you know. Just try to get you to look like your mom. Didn't happen, you know. People come up to me all the time and they say, if Avery's lost in a crowd, we know exactly where to take him. He looks just like you. Why? Because Avery's my child. He looks like me. What does that mean? When you look at Avery, you don't just see Avery, you see his father. When you look at Avery, you don't just see who he is, you see who his dad, who his father is. And because he's in my image, he looks like me. And the reason why God made us in his image is because it's when we are in his image that it is the only condition in which we find ourselves satisfied. And so the reason why God says don't worship anything else is because when you worship something else, what happens is you begin to look at a different image to tell you who you are. When you look at a wrong image, you're looking to something to satisfy you, to dictate who you are. Have you ever experienced this? Like Kiss and I, we went to Disneyland last year and we walked into like a room and our kids loved it. They were dying laughing. And there was a room full of mirrors. And you walked into that room and like there's one mirror I look at and I'm like, oh boy, Dylan, you are looking fit. Those 2 workouts last month really paying off now. We got that B shape just crushing life, you know? And then like you go to another mirror and it's like short and squat and you're like, boy, oh boy, do these hips lie, you know? Wow. You know, how did I even get in this room, you know? It's like, you're like this, you know, like, you know, the mirrors that are wavy and you're like, because what's happening, when you look in the right mirror, you get reflected back an accurate image. When you look in the wrong mirror, what you get back is a distorted image, a damaged image. And the reason why God says you shouldn't have any other God above me is because when you begin to look at the wrong image, what gets reflected back to you is not just a wrong and distorted image. It causes you to become wrong. It causes you to be damaged. It causes you to be distorted and damaged. And what happens is when you look to the wrong thing, it actually changes you for the worse. So when you worship money, let's give that example. When you worship money, what happens? You begin to become like what you worship because money is cold and calculating. It's not bad, it's not good, it's a tool. But when you make that God, what happens? You become cold and calculating. Every decision you make is through the profit or loss. It's not relational. God forbid, let me be generous in case I let go of something. And what happens? You become like what you worship and you don't realize you begin to damage yourself because you're looking at the wrong mirror, the wrong reflection of what you're supposed to be. When you make a relationship, when you make a guy or a girl your all in all, what happens is you begin to make decisions. You compromise because you're trying to please that person. If you've ever had this saying, man, how did I end up like that? I swore that I would never do that. How do you do that? Well, it's because you worship the wrong thing. Because you're so focused on pleasing him or her, you make decisions and compromise yourself. And all of a sudden what happens is you begin to experience what sin does to damage you because you're looking at the wrong thing to satisfy your soul. You're looking at the wrong thing to tell you who you're supposed to be. Man, if I can just achieve status, if I can just get popular opinion, what's happening? I'm looking for people's affection, not realizing that it doesn't make me more secure, it causes insecurity. And I'm so focused on pleasing people that I'll tell people what's politically correct, but I'll never tell them the truth because I'm afraid of what they might think about me instead of thinking about what might set them free. And so God says how you exercise your faith. You exercise your faith by you watch what you worship. The reason why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't bow down is because they recognized once I bow down to this, it begins to damage who I am. And when people look at me, they might not see my Father. See, when we exercise our faith in society, I think the first thing that we have to understand is we should have no other God before God. The question I have to ask myself, is there something that I'm looking to satisfy my soul outside of him? Because culture says if I give in to this, I'll be satisfied. But I think if I bow down to this, it actually might burn me. We exercise our faith by watching what we worship. We exercise our faith by being powerful in our innocence. So let me say it another way. Your innocence is powerful. They engage properly with culture because they engage with culture without compromise. This is what it says about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I think it's so great. It says that there were certain Jews whom you've appointed over the affairs. This is now all these officials that are accusing my boys Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these officials, whether it's from jealousy because they've risen through the ranks because of their character, or whether it's because they wanted to elevate favor in the king's eyes, they're throwing them under the bus and they're telling the king, oh king, these guys, they don't pay any attention to you. They don't serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And they say, like, Shadrach, Meshach, but they pay no attention. They're completely indifferent to you, which is not true. Shadrach and Meshach, Abednego, they were present. Like, they were engaged. They were present for the ceremony. They were dressed for the occasion. But what happened with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were engaged as much as they could be without compromise. And sometimes I think as Christians, for us to engage in society, we think that we can't engage at all. No, these guys they're employees of the government. They were there serving their heart out. They were there. They were present. They were engaged as much as they could be without compromising their faith. I think so oftentimes as Christians, we get a bad rap because we engage in a wrong way. Either we don't engage at all, or we engage in a way that turns people away from God. And I think Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they had a beautiful balance of how this was supposed to happen. I think the way that we engage right in society is, to be honest, is when we have a right perspective of what sin is. I think we engage right when we have a right perspective of sin, because so oftentimes the wrong perspective of sin causes us to have the wrong engagement when it comes to society. That if we don't see sin as a bad thing, if we just see sin as like, oh my goodness, that relationship that's crossing boundaries, oh boy, I hope they figure it out, it's not that bad, or like, hey, that, that way of living, oh my goodness, that's wrong, like it's not that big of a deal, I guess there's worse things out there, But if that's our mentality towards sin, what will happen is we'll never engage the way that we're supposed to as the church if we don't recognize that sin is the thing that devastates humanity more than anything else, that sin is the cause of all problems in society, that sin, the root behind everything is this thing called sin. If we recognize it for as devastating as it is, I love how Ken portrays this in one of his classes. He says the reason why Jesus was beaten beyond recognition because he needed to tell the world, this is what sin will do to you if you succumb to it. That sin beats you beyond recognition. I think one of the best examples we have is the civil rights movement, where we had a pastor stand up and says, because God created life and humanity and every human is equal in God's eyes, and the cause, the base of racism isn't just belief or just isn't society. The cause of racism is sin. I need to go do something about that. It caused the church to rush in, and there were some that sat on the sidelines. But civil rights comes from Christianity. In fact, let me go. Women's rights comes from Christianity. Human rights. Human rights comes from the Bible and the belief system that God made mankind, man and female, that they were equal. And so because I recognize the damage of sin and how it unwinds society, if I have that perspective of sin, it causes me to recognize it's my responsibility to rush in. On the flip side, I think sometimes we can give we could place too much emphasis on the sinner. Sometimes I think there's some people that we rail against and we think, man, that sinner can't be saved. And what we don't think about is maybe there's a power, there's a principality behind the person. That people aren't the problem, people are the prize. When we recognize that, we say, man, I'm not just going to sit back, but I'm also recognizing that the person that I'm up against, that person, that they might be making a mistake, but that person's not the problem. There's a power behind them. And as a Christian, I recognize that I can go and I don't have to pick it and I don't have to throw things or I don't have to be aggressive, but I can stand in the gap and say, I'm going to make a difference and I'm going to do it in a way that's loving and gracious, because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they engaged without compromise, but they were so gracious in how they did it. I love this. Look, like when it comes to how they engage the king, like the master of the universe, I love it because it's like they're the nicest guys, Like they're getting told to bow, and they're not railing against the man, I'll read this, and I can only see them doing this with a smile on their face. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, He can do it. And he will deliver us out of our hand, You're king, but we've got a greater king, But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. It's all good. You got to do what you got to do. We're going to do what we got to do. They're the nicest. We can be peaceful, yet still live a life full of conviction and trust. When an employer comes and asks you to compromise, it's okay to stand for what's right. I recognize it's your signature on my paycheck, but I know who supplies all of my needs. And so you might be asking me to do something, but I know who's really in charge. You know, when it comes to a relationship, man, you compliment me and you're asking me to compromise, but I know who completes me. And so I don't have to do that. That's okay. And so when it comes to our relationship with God, there's a way for us to engage in culture without compromising, but how we do it is just as important as why we do it. It's when we recognize who's in control that it enables you to trust and respond graciously. I think, if I'm being honest, the times that I've responded wrong to a person is when I've actually tried to control them. That's right. My job is to simply proclaim God. I don't always have to defend him.
You say that. Say that.
I realize, and it's a liberating thought, that I actually don't have the ability to change a person. Only he has. And so if I can just simply introduce somebody to Jesus, then he's the one that's going to help do all the transformation process. And maybe there's people in your life that you get frustrated and you react wrong. Could it be maybe we're trying to control somebody like Nebuchadnezzar was trying to control them? And recognizing that, man, my job is to serve, my job is to proclaim, God's job is to transform and change. And lastly, when it comes to culture, as the bands come to the platform, we exercise our faith by being known by our relationship to Jesus. I'm going to try and articulate this right, and so I'm going to try and make sure I say this the right way. Nebuchadnezzar went to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he said to them, he said, if you don't bow, I'm going to throw you into the fire, and you're going to get burnt. Nebuchadnezzar's response when culture and Christianity came in conflict was that now, because you're not conforming, I'm going to control you, and if you don't bow, you're going to get burnt. And we recognize Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego's response. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego still didn't bow. Even though they were in the face of a fire, a real thing that could physically hurt them, but yet they still didn't bow. Could it be that they understood something greater than the physical fire that was in front of them? I think Jesus tells this interesting story about heaven and hell. And he talks about a rich ruler and a man named Lazarus, and this rich ruler, this rich man didn't do anything for this poor man and lived a selfish life and had everything that he needed and yet didn't have a relationship with Jesus, and so he died. And in the next life, this rich man, he finds himself in hell, which is simply separation from God. And it says that this rich man he's thirsty. It says that he's so thirsty, and he looks up and he sees Lazarus and he says, I'm thirsty. I recognize I have a need. I recognize I have something that needs satisfying, but it was only on the other side of eternity that when he looked up, he recognized what could satisfy his thirst. That just like we can taste heaven here on earth, could it also be that people are tasting hell? That right now we recognize that there's something in my life, I have an insatiable thirst for satisfaction, and that's why I'm going to so many different things, relationship or career or money or education. I'm looking for something to satisfy my thirst. And could hell be one of these thought processes that hell is simply having a need, an insatiable appetite that I don't know what will satisfy? And that's what's burning me. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're confronted with this dilemma that if I bow, culture is saying I'm going to get burnt. But what's a bigger burn, what's a greater hurt is I know who's going to satisfy my needs. I know who can give living water. And you're telling me I might get burnt. But no matter how hard, no matter how hot, I don't have to fear it because I know what truly burns me. When my soul is thirsty and I've drunk from every other source and it doesn't satisfy, that is what hurts. We see that this fire that maybe some of you find yourself in today, it says that they didn't bow. Something happened in the fire. It says that they came in bound. But when they were in the fire, Nebuchadnezzar, he says, look, they're unburnt. Culture didn't have the ability to destroy them. But not only did it not have the ability to destroy them, because they went into the fire, the things that used to bound them began to be broken off their life? Could it be the pressure and the fire that you face at work, maybe with your family? Could this be not just a setback, but maybe could God be using this as a setup? Maybe could it be that God is actually saying there's a pressure situation because there's some things that are only broken off your life when you step into the fire, when you step into a season where you don't compromise that fear that used to paralyze you, and somebody begins to say, hey, why is it that you have so much joy? And you begin to step in the pressure. I'm not sure if that person's going to accept me or reject me, but it's in the fire as I begin to proclaim how good God is. That fear that used to shut my mouth, that fear begins to get broken off my life. You would never experience that if you don't ever go through the fire. Man, I'm so hungry for satisfaction, yet I found a God who satisfies my soul. And when people are trying to tell or stab me behind my back, I used to respond a certain way. I experienced pressure, but what used to bound me, what used to direct me, what used to change the course of my life, I don't actually have to care for your affection because I know who cares for my soul. I used to be bound, but now I'm free. I think there's some people here in this room and you walked into a pressure. Could God simply be using it to break some things off that used to bound you before? Lastly, I think what's so important about this passage is Nebuchadnezzar was in the fire. He looked in the fire and it says that 3 men were thrown in, but there was a 4th man. There was a 4th man. The Bible will tell us that Nebuchadnezzar, it looks like a son of God. Like, who is that in the fire with them? Don't you think it's so interesting that Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to bow down to an image that said it was God, and yet it was in the fire that Nebuchadnezzar saw the image of God? Could it be that Nebuchadnezzar said, this image is a God, little g, but it was when God's people were in the fire that Nebuchadnezzar saw for the first time, not just the image of a little g, they saw the image of God, who was Jesus himself, Jesus personified. Could it be that when you find yourself in the fire facing pressure, could it be that that is the opportunity that God says, this is how I'm seen? When things aren't going right in your life and yet you respond right, people marvel and say, why do you respond like that? It's an opportunity for Jesus to be seen. When people get around your marriage and instead of fighting and being distant, there's something different. What is it about this fire? I can see somebody that I don't recognize is here on earth. Could it be the fire is not a negative? Could it be that the fire is God's opportunity to be seen? Tonight, wow, here we go. Too much of a youth pastor now. Stop. Could it be this morning that your life and the pressure that you found yourself in last week, could that simply be an opportunity for God to be seen? Culture matters because culture contains people. People aren't the problem, they're the prize. And that when you go through the pressure, I love that somebody said it like this: your theology isn't revealed in the good times, it's revealed in the bad times. What you believe about God isn't revealed in the good times, it's revealed in the bad times. When you face the pressure, when you face the fire. When we live a life that's uncompromising, guess who's seen in the fire with us? Jesus himself, because he is the true image of God. He is the one that came and died on a cross and forgave and washed me and cleansed me, that loves me unconditionally, that I don't have to give into insecurity. Fear doesn't have to bound me. I don't have to live a life of compromise looking for affection, because everything that I need, what I'm finding, everything that I need is first and foremost found in him. And when I live that, people begin to see that. With every head bowed and every eye closed this morning, we're going to respond in just a moment and sing this song as a response to what God's going to do. But maybe you walked in here this morning, and if you were to be honest with yourself, you'd say, Dylan, I don't have a relationship with Jesus. That whole thing that you were talking about of looking for something to satisfy, I think that's me. I've been looking to a relationship. I made her, I made him my God. I made money and career. I look to that to be the ultimate source of satisfaction, and my life is devoid without meaning when I don't achieve it. When I've been looking for something, I'm thirsty. I'm like that man, I'm thirsty. I'm spiritually thirsty for something to satisfy. Could it be that the place that you haven't looked but you found yourself this morning, could it be that what you're looking for is this person called Jesus, who said, I'm living water. I can quench every thirst. I'm the answer that you've been looking for, regardless of your culture, your family, your background. Jesus surpasses all of that, and Jesus says, I'll be willing to step into your world. If you're here this morning, you say, Dylan, I don't know Jesus, or I've been running from Jesus. I need Jesus to encounter me this morning. I want you to just raise your hand right where you are. I want to pray for you right where you're at. If that's you, you say, Dylan, I need Jesus, or I've been running from Jesus. I need Jesus to come back into my life, or I need to give my life to him. I want you to just raise your hand right where you're at, and I want to pray for you right where you're at. You just 1, 2, 3, your hand goes up. Awesome. Awesome. Anybody else? We've got some service hosts that are going to come and give something. Awesome. 2, 3. Anybody else? 4. Anybody else? In the back, service hosts, keep your hand up. We just want to give you a card that if you could fill that out, turn it back in. We want to pray with you. We want to help you on this journey, that this is a decision that's going to change and transform your life. You can put your hands down. Maybe you're here this morning and you say, Dylan, I know Jesus, but I think I've compromised. I think I bowed down and I experienced the consequence. I got burnt. It hurt me. God's so good that he comes and washes us and cleanses us and forgives us and puts us back in right standing with him. If you'd say, Dylan, I think I bowed down to the wrong thing and I got burnt, would you just raise your hand? I want to pray for you right where you're at. Come on, awesome. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. I think the enemy so often tries to convince us we're the only one. More hands keep going up. You can put your hands down. Is there anybody here, if you'd be honest, you say, Dylan, I feel like I'm in the fire. I feel like I'm in the pressure. There's something at work. There's something in family. There's a pressure in a relationship that I'm finding this decision to bow down, to compromise in the wrong thing. And I need God to help stand with me, to recognize that I have the confidence that if he's for me, who can be against me? If that's you, would you just raise your hand? I want to pray for you. Come on. Wow, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Man, too many hands. I can't even count them all. Church, well, this is what we're going to do. Would you stand to your feet? We're going to declare God's goodness. And then we're going to believe that God's goodness is going to encounter us right here this morning. We're going to sing this song and then we're going to pray.